So in preparation for this movie coming out, I actually rewatched the original movie the other night just to sort of brush up on everything that had happened. I really enjoyed the first movie, but upon rewatching it, I gotta say, it really reminded me of Resident Evil. Not because of zombies or virus outbreaks or anything, but the tension and the location and everything that was sort of going on with the way the characters would move around the environment. It's a creepy house. They had to go from room to room and they get keys that would open doors on other sides of the rooms. Like, there was nothing nuts, like go get a medallion and then a gem and then a serpent statue to open a door. But to keep with that comparison, the blind man kind of reminded me of the tyrant. So I guess with the sequel, it's kind of like, what would have happened if the tyrant eventually had a daughter and settled down? Well, now we have our answer. Don't Breathe 2 is the sequel to the 2016 movie Don't Breathe. And I'm just going to say this before we get into unpacking it and everything, in my opinion. The title, horrible. I don't know what else they could have called it, but here's the thing. With the first movie, Don't Breathe made so much sense because it was about a group of teens that broke into this old man's house who happened to be blind, could also dispatch you quite easily. So the tension came from them being quiet. Don't breathe, don't make a sound. That's where all the tension came from. And that movie was spectacular. I highly recommend it. No, it's nothing award worthy, but it's still a really decent horror movie or thriller, depending on how you want to look at it. But when it comes to the sequel, the story is so different that the whole idea of remaining quiet or not breathing is kind of irrelevant. Sure, you could argue that the bad guys should have shut up. That way the blind man wouldn't have been able to find them. But still, in this movie, it's been 8 years roughly since the first one. We get an 8 years later title card after a opening scene that's very reminiscent of the first movie. And now we catch up with the blind man who has a daughter, which right off the bat, you're like, okay, well, how did he get this daughter? It's the same girl from the opening shot. We understand that. So it's probably not from the means that were revealed in the first movie. Spoilers for Don't Breathe. He was trying to impregnate a woman who had run over his little girl so he could get his daughter back. It was a whole thing. So we know that this little girl probably isn't his legitimate daughter. He has spent the last 8 years with this little girl and he has been training her up for any sort of survival situation she might find herself in. Gee, I wonder if that's going to come in handy. And as the story goes on, of course, we get introduced to a group of bad guys who want to, as far as we know, harvest organs from people, and they're coming after her, presumably because she's young and healthy. And of course, as we know from the first movie, the blind man is not going to stand for that. So violence and protection will ensue. Every time I talk about the premise of these movies, I don't want to give away too much because there's so much that could be considered spoilerish. So I will try to keep as much of it as vague as possible because I don't like it when stuff gets spoiled for me. Whoever ruined Star Wars Episode 7 for me, I'm looking for you. I'll get some of my more nitpicky things out of the way here. Number one, this movie, it's not as good as the first one. Sequels so very rarely are, and this one is no exception. And like I mentioned, the whole idea of Don't Breathe and all of the great tension that came from that first movie, I didn't feel it here. Yes, there are some very intense moments, but I will argue that something being intense is vastly different than a scene being tense. Does that make sense? And for me, the climax of the movie, a little bit predictable. Those are my only real qualms with this thing. I had a good time with this movie. Stephen Lang does great again. He's given the opportunity to flesh this character out a little bit more, and he's really good in the role. I mean, he's getting up there in age. I don't know exactly how old he is, but he's presented as a fairly elderly man in this movie, and he can still kick some serious butt. The little girl who's playing his daughter, Phoenix, she was pretty good on screen as well. Child actors are very hit and miss, and in this case, she's a hit. We'll say that. Because I've been knocking on the lack of tension so much, I will give the movie this. There is a scene near the beginning when the bad guys are breaking into the house where the little girl puts to use all the training she's received over the years. It's one of those long shots with no cuts, at least that's the way it appears, where the camera just follows her as she is quietly escaping these bad guys. And seeing her do crazy little stuff like set a timer on her watch and then chuck it into the next room, wait for the alarm to go off to distract him, and then scuttle under her bed and roll over the stairs. All of that stuff was really cool to see, and I do applaud that scene. And I will give it this. It was tension filled. Another thing I like about this movie is something that I liked about the first movie, and that is that it's pretty lacking in moral ambiguity. Like, none of the characters, I would say, are good. Same as in the first movie, you had a group of kids breaking into a house. On one hand, they're clearly the bad guys. On the other, they're just a group of young kids trying to get by because they come from broken homes. And then on the other side, we've got the blind man who's just this old elderly man whose home is being broken into, but then he's also keeping this prisoner in the basement who he has impregnated and is waiting to give him a daughter. I don't know who to side with. And that sort of stuff continues in this movie. It's nice to not have a clear-cut good and bad guy. Everybody's sort of, well, really, when you get down to it, everybody's just sort of bad. But the blind man is definitely presented as less bad, or at least the lesser of the evil options in this movie. And like I said about Stephen Lang and his performance, he does get the opportunity to have a bit of a character arc here. By the end of the movie, his character is a bit different than he started in the beginning. I didn't say it was a strong arc, but again, like I said, it's not as good as the original. That's because we sort of got to know, well, we got to know 2 out of the 3 of the kids that were breaking into the house in that first movie, and didn't get to know a lot about the blind man outside of what he was doing to get his daughter back. And now in this movie, it's kind of flipped. We're seeing everything from his perspective, or from his, at least, household's perspective. And with that being said, when it comes to the bad guys, they're just sort of very one-dimensional characters. Yes, some of it eventually gets fleshed out in the 3rd act, but for the most part, all of the bad guys here, and there's a lot more of them than 3, they're all very generic, and they are clearly just here to be dispatched, and in what sort of creative ways. That's the hook. I mean, another glaring thing is like, how does this happen to the same guy twice? That was my question going into it, and the way it kind of works out, it honestly does make sense. For the way the blind man lives his life and what he would have done to find himself in the situation with Phoenix and everything that sort of happens in this movie around him and her. Okay, they've kind of dealt with the fact that there's no way this blind man would have had his home broken into twice. And now it is a different home because his first house burned down. I just watched the first movie. Yikes. Either way, I have to make a comment on this. And if you live in Detroit or know somebody who does, number 1, I'm sorry. Number 2, can you clear it up? But some stuff goes down and no authorities are called. There's guns going off. There's fires burning. Not once are there sirens of any sort that are coming to this location. Like, is that how it is in Detroit? Or is that just for the movie? Because if that is how it is in Detroit, why do people still live there? And that being said, why did the blind man choose to stay in Detroit after the events of the first movie? I mean, I guess he can't really see anything, so I guess it doesn't matter. It just doesn't seem like a very friendly environment. And it seems like a very hostile environment to be raising a little girl in. The movie also had some really nice imagery, I guess is the best way to put it, especially at the end, that I really liked. A lot of people might think it's kind of corny, but I thought it was actually fairly well done. Now let's call a spade here. I'm going to butcher his name. Fede Alvarez. He directed the first movie, wrote the first movie. He also directed the Evil Dead reboot, which was pretty good. And he produced and co-wrote Don't Breathe 2, but he didn't direct it. I don't have so much experience with his movies that I could really notice much difference. I think he might have had a very strong guiding hand here in terms of the way the camera moved and the way the scenes were set up, especially that one-shot scene. I feel like he probably helped. And if he didn't, then to the director of this movie, bravo, sir. You did a great job at least emulating what he did in the first movie. I kind of struggled at the beginning when I was talking about Don't Breathe, the first one, whether or not it was just a horror movie or a thriller movie. I mean, it's probably a combination of the two. This movie is not a horror movie at all. Where the first one had moments of tension where characters were stuck in closets, being quiet, and that scene with the night vision in the first movie, that was incredible. Nothing really like that here. Something kind of similar with smoke near the end, but still not as effective as that night vision scene. I'm getting off track. This movie, action thriller is almost how I would describe it. There are a couple jump scares here and there, but nothing that I would say classifies this movie as a horror movie. It's hard to criticize these movies simply for the fact that I'm just so excited to be able to go back to the theater after so long, but I'll try to do my best. For Don't Breathe 2, I'll give it a 6 out of 10. It was an enjoyable movie, but it was an unnecessary sequel that I guess they felt they had to make based on the last scene of the original movie where it turned out he was alive. And it has some intense moments, and the story isn't bad and makes sense for the characters in this world, I don't think it's a movie that I'm going to remember very well. Don't Breathe sticks out. There are scenes from that movie that I can still remember. I mean, I just watched the movie. I remembered them before I watched it. It was an impactful movie. This one just kind of feels like a generic sequel. A decent time, just not incredible. So what about you? Have you guys seen Don't Breathe 2 yet? If you have, let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next one.